All right, cover three. This is one of the 49ers' favorite coverages. It's one that has 4 underneath defenders to cover those 6 underneath zones. Those 4 underneath zones that are going to be covered in cover 3 are going to be basically your hook curl areas and your curl flat areas. So in this diagram here, you can see the hook curl with the Mike and the Will, and then you've got your curl flat with your safety and your nickelback in this case. And then you've got your 3 deep defenders, which is going to be your 2 corners and your safety. There are lots of different ways to play cover 3. This is just one of them. And so it's not always necessarily going to be the safety in that curl flat area. In fact, the Niners play it a little bit differently in their preferred method of cover 3. But that's when you get into like sky and cloud and different variants. But the key, I think, is not that the safety is always in the curl flat, but rather that someone is in that underneath zone and someone is in the deep third. So think less about the position and more about the zone, and you'll be able to identify cover 3.
Yep, and that really goes, I think, for pretty much every coverage, right? Definitely, we're going to try to provide an example of one way and usually like a more common way that it gets run. But the main thing here to focus on and identifying is I've got 4 underneath defenders, and they're in these 4 areas of the field, and I've got 3 deep defenders, but I can get there in a bunch of different ways. And so as we kind of move to the video here, we'll look at actually a way, it was really hard to find an example of the 49ers using that specific rotation where you get the safety as the other curl flat player. And so we're going to show how they kind of switch 2 of those roles, but still end up with your 3 deep guys and your 4 underneath guys all in the same spot.
Yeah, so at this point, we're looking at another 3x1. Apparently, we love 3x1s. But you want to confirm first the rush. And so you're going to see, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4 at the snap. All right. Now we get to look at our deep defenders and our coverage shell to determine how many players we've got underneath. And so this is where things happen a little bit later. And so it's going to be, you have to wait a little bit to kind of get your coverage shell. You see that Sherman start to move deep a little bit. You've got your deep middle safety. He's going to go into his back pedal right away. You've got the corner up at the top of the screen who's going to be backpedaling as well. You can see that the shell, after just a couple of seconds, is indeed going to be the safety in the 2 corners.
Right. And so if you're starting to get hung up on, okay, what's this guy doing? He's the one that, okay, as I'm picturing this in my mind, he's not really going to where I thought he was going to go, right?
I thought he was going
to where he would have on the diagram. And so he's the one that we'll kind of focus on, because I think there's 2 ways you could interpret like what he is doing, right? As you're just kind of first getting used to this stuff. You may see it here and kind of pause at this front and be like, hey, I got 4 deep defenders. I got these guys right here that are all 4 deep. Like, how do I know this isn't quarters, right? What makes this different from that quarters play that we just looked at? And the key thing is going to be, again, the play of the safeties and really what they're keen on that's going to be different. And so if this was quarters, right, that would mean that this guy is a quarter safety, this guy is a quarter safety right here. And so this guy up here to the field side safety, I think that's Tart, is going to be the guy that kind of gives it away a little bit more at first. Because if he was playing quarters, one, we would expect him to be quite a bit closer to the line of scrimmage usually, or at least moving a little bit towards the line of scrimmage right after the snap. Because again, they're usually going to sit in kind of that 10 to 12 yard range most of the time. And the other thing he's going to be doing is his eyes are going to go usually to the number 2 receiver, but definitely to these interior kind of slot players here, because their action is going to determine really what he does on the play. But instead, as we let it roll, you can see he's opened up to the middle of the field more. And yes, he is hugging this side, right? He's kind of in line with this number 3 receiver, the inside most slot player. He's not really getting over to the deep middle, but that's because they want him over to the trip side, right, where I've got more threats. And so he's just kind of hugging the trips over here, but you can see his eyes are really opening to the middle of the field back to the quarterback as he continues to get depth after the snap. So that's what tells me that he's playing kind of that deep middle role as opposed to a quarter safety. And then as we transition to this other safety here, again, in the diagram, how this would have looked is we would have got this safety coming down and out to the curl flat. we would have had a hook player here, a hook player here, and then a curl flat player here. But the 49ers like to switch that rotation up and basically get this player out to the curl flat and drop this safety down in the hook. And this is the way they run it the majority of time, I would say, when they're in just kind of the standard cover 3 look. And it's a similar idea. The reason why is a similar idea to kind of the quarters adjustment that we saw in the previous video, which is they really want a guy that's in better position to help on any of this deep in-breaking stuff, intermediate in-breaking stuff from the number 3 receiver. So by having him drop and just kind of sit in that area, he's taking away a common route that a lot of offenses love to go to in this coverage.
So how do you differentiate that safety as an underneath defender as opposed to that deep defender, right? You've got to go back to the depth that you expect them to get in the kind of 15-yard coverage areas. And this is where you also have to take a look at threats and where the player goes. It's never going to be a perfect kind of drop to a spot and the player is just going to sit there and do nothing, right? They're usually going to be affected a little bit by the route combinations, but you have to remember that 15 yards is really the area that they're going to want to cover from the line of scrimmage. So that means that the underneath defender is really going to be up to and could be up to that 30-yard area, the 30-yard line area, if there's going to be a dig or a crosser or someone who's going to threaten that area of the field. And so even though he's pretty deep down the field, that's going to be his primary threat. He's still moving downfield. He's part of that underneath area. And then you've got the drops of your corners and your safety that are giving you that cover 3 shell.
Yep. And so this is another one, again, we haven't been giving situation at the top, but if you are kind of taking a look up to the top and look at the sticks here, you can see that it's another 3rd and long, right? 3rd and long, the reason why a lot of these plays that we're showing are 3rd and long plays is because you tend to see a little bit more vanilla coverage from defenses who really are just kind of concerned about getting guys with a lot of depth, making sure that they've got a lot of bodies around the first down marker, so that they can hopefully take away some of those routes. They know that they definitely don't need to be concerned with, stuff underneath in this area here, because they're going to be able to come up and make tackles on it. So you tend to see some more vanilla looks in those situations, which is why all of our examples are there. When you get into more base situations, teams get a little trickier and some of this stuff becomes a little bit more difficult to identify. So that's why you're getting the examples that we've got here.
Yeah, so we've got 4 underneath defenders with this coverage. And then ultimately there's going to be the last coverage that we're going to talk about, which is one where you have 3 underneath defenders, and that's going to be a fire zone. And so this is going to be what your fire zone looks like. Your fire zone, because you're sending an extra rusher, rather than having 7 in coverage, because remember, we always identify the number of rushers that we have first to tell us how many coverage defenders we've got. Now, in a fire zone, if you've got 5 rushers, you don't have 7 defenders, you've got 6. And that means that you've got 6 players to cover the 6 underneath zones and the max number of zones at the back end, which is going to be 4. But when you've got just 6 players, usually what teams do is they take 3 deep and 3 under. And that is going to be the basic coverage shell for the different variations of fire zone that you'll see. Defensive coordinators get really inventive with how they plan out their rush pattern, but behind it is generally some version of 3 and 3, 3 deep and 3 underneath. In the diagram that we're showing here, you've got a nickel blitz, which is something the Niners didn't do a ton, but when they did it, it was incredibly effective. And you've got your linebackers who are dropping into the hole. And now the players are going to change their responsibility because they've got so many zones to cover underneath. They're going to change into those skiff players, those seam, curl, flats, SCF. And they're basically going to make sure that they don't have a threat down the seam, move to the curl zone, and then move to the flat in order to cover all of the areas of the field that they need in order to try to stop offenses from doing what they want to do.
Right. And as a reminder, again, this was something we mentioned on the pod as well, but we'll say it here again. Seam, not an area of the field that we identified specifically when in that very first diagram on the first video there that showed how the field gets divided up into different zones. But it's generally kind of this area here between the numbers and the hash, right? Usually I would say hugging the numbers a little bit more than the hash, but that's the area that they want to be able to protect first. And it's just because with this 3 deep, 3 under type of structure, it becomes very holy if you get 4 verticals, right? You got a lot of space here. You don't have as many players underneath that can cushion that stuff. So they really want to make sure that they can protect that seam throw that a lot of teams like to go to against cover 3 and make sure that they're not beat for a big play. So now we'll kind of switch it over to the video here and take a look. And so the other thing that you get with fire zones, and again, this one is a little bit different, a little bit more complex already from kind of the basic coverage shells that we've been talking about up to this point. A lot of times you're getting more disguise mixed in because they don't want to give away where that rusher is coming from. And so there's just a little bit more involved with these plays, even at their most basic than some of the plays we've been talking about before. But you can see K1 right here, he becomes my 5th rusher, right? So as we get just right after the snap, I've got my 4 down linemen, K1 there, I've got 5 rushers. So at that point, I know I'm dealing with 1 fewer coverage defender on the back end, and we need to identify where my deep players are getting to.
Yeah, so you look at Marcel Harris, you can tell immediately because of the way that he bails, he's moving to that deep middle zone. Okay, we've got one of our coverage shell identified, right? Now, it's going to be pretty simple just based on alignment to notice that Richard Sherman also going to be one of those deep players. He does this all the time, but he just opens his hips, and he knows he's going to have to cover that deep area, and that's what he's going to do to make sure that he can get and stay over the top of a player, especially a player as fast as DK Metcalf. He's definitely going to open his hips a little early. And then you've got, on the other side, you've got Ahkello Witherspoon, who's doing something very similar, right? He's going to kind of move around a little bit, but then at the snap, immediate back pedal and immediate hip open just to kind of stay over the top. And so those are going to be my 3 deep defenders. Now I've got my 3 underneath defenders, and I can begin to identify what they're trying to do. And while I wish that this coverage would stay, kind of picture perfect, the NFL hardly ever is. And now you get to see a little bit of what it looks like when a defender carries a route, because they know that they're kind of responsible for that in what that linebacker does in Fred Warner. But ultimately, you've got your 3 coverage defenders up top, and then your 3 underneath defenders, one of which is going to carry her out.
So these 3 underneath defenders are really where things, I think, start to change more from just kind of the basic cover 3 picture that we were looking at before, right? Because no longer are we're venturing into kind of the land of match coverages with this. And the difference, the key thing there is that my defenders, rather than focusing on getting to spots on the field, right? So if I was just kind of doing normal spot drop stuff, I'd have a whole defender and Warner here, and he'd just be kind of sitting back generally in the middle of the field, kind of looking, he'd probably be leaning a little bit towards the trip side because I've got more threats over there, but he's going to kind of just settle in the middle of the field, kind of like we saw him do on that 1 quarters play against the Rams. And then same thing with these guys, right? So this is my other, my 1 skiff player here, and then I believe it's Ward here that's dropping down. That's going to be my other guy, and they would kind of be getting to landmarks around the top of the numbers, so they'd each be looking to get to that specific area of the field as their first priority. And then they would just kind of see, okay, like what receivers are coming to me? Who do I need to kind of like look to get around and underneath and all that? What changes here is they're not doing that. They don't care about getting to specific areas of the field. What they care about is identifying specific receivers on the field. And so the way that they do that are my skiff players. So again, linebacker here, safety here. They're focused on the number 2 receiver to their side. So that's going to be this slot receiver here on the field side to the top of the screen, and my running back down into the boundary at the bottom. So they're on the number 2 receiver. Warner in the middle is on the number 3 receiver. So that's going to be the tight end here. And so that's what you can see them key up right after the snap, right? So Warner immediately opening to that tight end. And this is actually a good example of the number designation that a player gets before the snap doesn't always remain that way after the snap based on how the receivers will release. So that tight end is the number 3 receiver right at the start. That's who Warner's looking at. But he takes this immediate flat path to the outside, and that makes this receiver the number 3 receiver, right? So he becomes the inside most receiver that side, and that's where Warner shifts to and looks to try to run with.
And that's
down
ultimately
at the bottom.
When you just think of the idea of match coverage, I think that's a perfect example of what it means to match the pattern. and not necessarily match the player. Matching the player is what you do in man coverage, right? You just follow the man around. And in zone, you just kind of stick in a zone. In this case, the distribution of the routes ultimately affects where the defensive player goes. And that's what Fred Warner is doing here. He ends up sticking to 3 based on the route distribution and carrying that player because he knows that's his responsibility based on the route distribution. He needs to basically make sure that he gives Marcel Harris a little bit of help up the seam, and that's exactly what he does. And Fred Warner is really good at that, incidentally. That's one of the things he does very well.
Yeah, he's obviously a very athletic player, does a good job at turning and running with this. And we'll come back to him so we can kind of talk a little bit about what happens on this play because it's not necessarily a great look for the 49ers defense. But just to kind of finish out those keys with the 2 skiff players that we've got here and the differences before we get to that, you can see again, I think this is the clearest example with the linebacker down here at the bottom. He's not getting depth at all after the snap, right? He's actually moving forward a little bit to really match up with this running back. And he's going to essentially kind of take him largely where he goes. And 3-by-1 like that, in a lot of situations, these guys become manned. They really just end up kind of locking on those 2 players, and then you zone it up a little bit more to the trip side. Not 100% of the time, but that's kind of the way it works out a good majority. And then again, our other skiff player here at the top, he becomes underneath the number 2 receiver, right, which is him. So once he sees the distribution, he's looking to get under this route here. And he does have 2 players that is typically that are in his zone, right? So both these receivers are guys that he's responsible for, and he does a good job of prioritizing these, right? I need to get depth. I need to take away this route here and make him throw this underneath one. Where it breaks down is my guy, Akella Witherspoon here. And this is where the breakdown in the coverage is Akello's not sticking in my deep third, right? He gets a little too preoccupied with this receiver, doesn't continue to get depth over the top, and so it opens up this space for the corner route. This is not a play like Warner, even though he's keyed on the number 3 receiver. This isn't a route that he's going to run with. He's really focused on more if he stays up the seam, if he takes any sort of in cut across the field. Those are going to be the throws that he's really looking to get to. Once he makes that deep break to the corner, my deep defenders here need to be on that.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the question, that the last question I have for you, David, here, which is, we've talked about a lot of man principles, especially down to the 1 receiver side. And oftentimes you'll hear the term like man everywhere he goes, where that corner is going to be manned up against that individual. You've got man over here. How do I know this is not effectively man coverage? Because I've got Warner who's sticking to a man. I've got Sherman who's sticking to a man. I've got linebacker who's sticking to a man. And now we're talking about pinning it on Akella Witherspoon. What are the keys here in this coverage as you're identifying it that tells you, yeah, this is cover 3?
So I think it's really these underneath players that we were talking about, right? That's going to be the key difference. We also get some. So we kind of started closer to the snap, but we get some keys to help us out if we roll it back with motion. And so motion is a way that the offense is going to always look to try to identify man zone, right? So you can see I start with my tight end here wide, and then we're actually going to motion him in tight to the formation. And you can see just by alignment, the 49ers here are not showing any sort of man look, right? I've got a corner that's sitting deep and inside, his eyes back to the ball, not on a man. I don't have guys aligned over these 2 receivers here. And then once I get that motion, nobody follows him, right? Everybody just kind of bumps inside a little bit to adjust to the new formation that I've got. And so already pre-snap, all my keys are telling me that this is probably zone. And then when it comes to fire zone specifically, like fire zone, granted, if you focus just on the coverage players can be a little tough because it will match up and it can look like man a lot of times. You just have to know that with this 5-man rush, 3 deep teams love to play this shit. Like they just they sit in these fire zone concepts all the time. And so it's one of those that you'll become a little bit more comfortable with it the more experience you get looking at this stuff. But yeah, I think use those pre-snap keys is going to be a big helpful thing. And then also, yeah, after the snap, It's a subtle difference, but it is a difference between a player who is manned up on somebody and a player who is zoning and matching. They're kind of looking to the area, but they're going to shuffle like Warner does here, right? He's clearly not manned on that tight end. He's looking to that area for his key, and then once he gets his key, that tells him where to go.
All right, well, that does it for our Identifying Coverages video series. Definitely leave any questions you might have about what you've seen or what we've covered in the comments down in the Patreon feed. Thanks again for tuning in, and as always, go Niners.